Hey John, Dan Meyer here.
Hey Dan,
How are you?
good.
I did the big house 5K last weekend with my daughter.
Oh wow. Yeah, I
Yes.
should have given it.
I was looking for you.
Yeah, exactly. I was in the stands at the
You're
at the basketball game.
oh, fine, fine.
No,
Yeah,
just kidding. I wasn't there either, but
no, it's fun. But you guys got hit. We were down on that right by that ice hockey rink that got hit last night.
oh yeah. Well, I was right by the house that got a tree in it, which was my house. So
Wow,
yesterday was an adventure, but everyone's safe. But
oh, good. Wow, that's unbelievable.
Welcome, everyone. I know it's 1 o'clock here on the East Coast. Thanks, everyone, for joining on time. We're going to give it another minute or so just to make sure that we have a critical mass before we open it up for quorum. John, it looks like my sense is that we have critical mass, so we could get started.
great. Okay, welcome everyone to the April 16th meeting of the Board of Directors. We'll go ahead and as our first action item, go ahead and call for a quorum.
See, the quorum link was added to the chat function. So if I could ask all board members to please click the quorum link to acknowledge that you are present. And once I get word from the team that that is gone through, I will announce. John, quorum has been reached.
Great, thank you. I just had a challenge with the quorum link myself. Okay, so welcome everyone. As I mentioned, just again as a reminder, this is a public meeting. Please engage during the session and turn on your video if possible. Keep your microphone muted when not speaking. Closed captioning is available to anyone who wishes to use it, and please use the raise hand function to be recognized rather than using the chat. Please reserve the chat to addressing technical issues. Next slide. Want to take a moment here before we get started with the main meeting materials and welcome Stephen Whiteson to the board of directors. As you'll recall, Steve was elected to the board at our last board meeting, but Steve was unable to attend. So I'd like to turn it over to Steve. Steve was a representative to the Patient Affairs Committee. He also has more recently served on the North America Regional Perfusion Work Group, where he's been an invaluable contributor. So, Steve.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Dr. McGee. Yeah, I'm Steve Whiteson. Nice to meet everyone. Heart transplant recipient, received my transplant in 2019 at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York on my birthday. Quite a present. Um, I'm a retired corporate attorney. Um, been on the Patient Affairs Committee for close to 4 years now. And advocacy is something that I take seriously, spend hours out of each day doing it. I don't want to spend, we have much more important things here to talk about than me, but if anybody is interested in learning anything about me, feel free to drop me a email. We'll spend 5 or 10 minutes to chat at some point. The only reason I think that is somewhat important is sometimes when you sit on the board with someone and they make comments, it's nice to know where they're coming from. But one thing I did want to say before I close is, I'm here on this board because Director Nicastro is not. So anything we do, anything I do in a positive fashion, I want that to be in his honor. And I hope we do some great things. Uh, thanks, Dr. McGee.
Thanks, Steve. I first actually met Steve at the region 2, I believe, um, form in the fall. I met him in the video sort of way, but his comments were just so heartfelt and on target that I actually reached out to him specifically afterwards just to get his thoughts about things. So I'm very happy that Steve has accepted this position and look forward to him being another valuable contributor to the board. All right. Thank you all. Next slide. So this is the agenda for today. We're going to first approve 2 prior meeting summaries, which were in the board packets. We're going to get an update from Dr. Justin Wilkerson about AOS work group and next steps. We'll move to some updates and then we'll open up for other and new business and move into closed session. So next slide. So going to have approval to the prior meeting summaries. We could not transact business the meeting after Peter's passing, so there are 2 summaries we need to approve. Next slide. So we're asking for approval for the February 19th and the March 19th board meetings. As you'll recall, we also had a meeting, an ad hoc board meeting on April 3rd. Those minutes are still, or those summaries are still being generated, but the motion before us is to approve the summaries from February 19th and March 19th of 2026. Can I have
Make a motion to approve both of those?
Thanks,
Second.
Cody.
Second.
Thanks, Dan. Okay. With those approved, there's now a link in the chat. It is, if you were not a participant of those meetings, that is fine, but you should abstain from voting on the minutes if you weren't present, unless you watch the video of the minutes of the meeting, sorry. And let us know when those votes are in.
Just waiting for confirmation. The vote has been approved, 24 approved, 0 reject, 2 abstain. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. So next item of business is going to be the update from Justin Wilkerson about the allocation out of sequence work. As people will recall, the board responded to a directive to form a work group and address critical issues around allocation out of sequence. Justin and several other members, Justin both has formed a great team and led a great team in addressing this. So I'm going to introduce Justin, who, as you all know, is also our secretary. Justin.
Thank you. Appreciate the time to be able to give this presentation to the board and to the community. Thank you for allowing me to discuss allocation out of sequence, in particular, John, for bringing me on to chair it. My intent for this brief is to give an update to the community. Before I do that, I'd like to get into the detail. Before I get into the details of our work, I do want to tie this to OPTN modernization, discuss that for a moment. The modernization efforts that HRSA so diligently has been undertaking. Allocation out of sequence work is intrinsically aligned with OPTN modernization. Some of the projects that I'll discuss are more easily implemented than others. There are costs and technology updates associated with all the projects. And as we move from concept to draft, we had to consider these factors and how the projects aligned with modernization efforts and expenses. As you'll see, some of what we propose should be easier to implement than other aspects. Ultimately, all of this work, how it is implemented, how it is recorded, and what actions are necessary as a result of this new policy are directly correlated with UNED and various aspects of it. The system to replace the current version of UNED is on the modernization horizon. Upgrades to legacy systems to enact new or changing policy must be meticulously contemplated to determine whether the timeline of that benefit is worth the cost. So I just want to state that up front. Next slide, please. The allocation out of sequence group was 3 teams comprised of 38 members from the community, including medical professionals, patients, and transplant centers from transplant centers and OPO staff. Board member Kevin Lee was a team lead along with myself and Dr. Stephen Potter. They did an excellent job of leading their teams. We also had key contributions from HRSA, particularly Dr. Sarah Lasky and her data science team. AAR and Taylor Melnson and board officers had a lot of contributions. We also had some very interesting guest speakers that had a lot of great ideas and how they did their work. There was interesting discovery and contributions from all the attendees. The collaboration with all these volunteers, HRSA, members of the board, and the AAR has been the most rewarding aspect of this project for me anyway. Next slide, please. There were 3 charges to our work group. 1 was to create an analytic definition of an offer. 2 was to define the conditions acceptable to create an expedited pathway for kidneys, with the idea that this could at some point or eventually become, oh, sorry, I see my somehow a shot at me there, become maybe implemented for other organs, and then to monitor allocation out of sequence or have some analytic ways to monitor allocation out of sequence. I'll speak more about those topics in the next slide, but did want to take a moment to give the big picture timeline and how we got where we're at now. Up front, I do want to state that all 3 teams have completed some aspects of their work and turned in initial drafts. And this initial work was done from September of last year through December. On the 9th of January, the 3 teams turned in essentially 4 proposals to board leadership and HRSA. The teams were then put on a temporary pause while these projects were put under review. HRSA submitted a feedback response letter to the OPTN board and to our work group on February 9th. This paper had some really good recommendations and insights for our work going forward. We then needed several coordination meetings with myself and the board officers and HRSA and AAR to ensure we were all aligned going forward. As always in these large expansive projects that are undertakings, we continue to make discovery and do to this day. We're awaiting a second HRSA, some HRSA feedback, and are going to get started with our work group here in short order within the next week or so. We're going to get started again. Next slide, please. So here's where we get to the meat of it. What have we accomplished so far? One notable general accomplishment, perhaps more attributable to the board leadership and HRSA than to our work group, has been quite a dramatic reduction in allocation off sequence in spring of 2025. We believe that OPOs and transplant programs reacted proactively to reduce allocation out of sequence in advance of any specific actions or policy updates that would be enacted by the board. We concurrently have watched wastage to ensure that it has not increased as allocation out of sequence has reduced. And if you look individually at these programs, and all this data is posted online, you can see that certain programs were able to drop it and were able to keep their wastage low while the allocation out of sequence drops. Some programs were more successful than others, and that's what my endeavor was to dive into that and see why some programs were particularly successful, which is what we did. Dr. Stephen Potter's offer team was tasked to establish a clear definition for an offer. The reason this was a critical piece of allocation out of sequence was that there was not previously an analytic definition. Rather, it was an operational definition, how it was applied. The result was considered, I'm sorry, just my screen's jumping around. The operational meaning that an offer was considered only for organs that were transplanted, but was not reviewed for organs that were not transplanted. The result of not tracking all the organs was multifaceted, but it is notable that allocation out of sequence could not be accurately tracked, nor could all the background processes, excuse me here, I lost my place here. Processes or organ offers made that were never used were able to be tracked. Also, there was not a good tracking system for what exactly constituted an offer. Was a phone call to discuss an offer an offer? Was an electronic notification an offer? If a program informally refused an offer, was it formally recorded as an offer? Was a candidate screened out by a filter considered to be an offer? Because these matters were unclear, there was not a standard definition for an offer. Since there was not a clear standard definition, there was no way to keep good statistics on what was really happening with our organs. There was also some confusion with language that needed to be cleared up since there were previously multiple ways to consider what an offer was. The task of this team was to make a single useful analytic definition that could be recorded. They wrote a draft that concisely defined an offer, that described the necessary components of an offer, and they outlined the minimum requirements for an offer to be a formal offer. It was also noted that an offer had to be electronically recorded. This work was intended to be general and not specific to a particular organ, which I'll get into in a moment here. Kevin Lee's EPP team was tasked to define the criterion that could be used to enable a kidney to enter an expedited pathway to allocation. The problem was that without an expedited pathway, there was no set standard for quickly moving an organ to the correct patient on a match run outside of a normal process. This caused two problems that led to allocation out of sequence. One, the first problem was that the greater share of kidneys that need to be expedited were kidneys that were challenging to place due to a number of factors that could be generalized as KDPI, but also could be considered donor age, health, immunology, a number of other factors. So the second issue was that organs that were placed that should have been placed lower on the list. So since these two groups of organs were intermixed, the second group, which is the one that needed to be focused on for allocation out of sequence, was difficult to track and to track and analyze. Since they were intermixed with all the kidneys that were challenging to place, they couldn't be analyzed to see the results of the allocations out of sequence. If the challenging kidneys could be expedited, then auditing allocation out of sequence would be much easier. Kevin's team turned in an initial draft of its work. It outlined the specific organ hurdles necessary to allow entry into an expedited pathway. Its initial draft was close to completion, but it needs additional work, which I'll speak about in a moment. And my compliance team was charged to build a system to audit allocation out of sequence. We attempted to develop a framework for that type of program to audit, to allow program mentoring, to share information and best practices amongst OPOs, and to recommend remediation actions when a member either failed to meet established standards repeatedly or if they committed an egregious violation. The compliance team also reviewed an allocation process currently utilized in Europe. Eurotransplant allocates organs in 8 different European countries. It utilizes their REAL, or it's a recipient-oriented extended allocation process. It is essentially a system of concurrent offer clocks. That speeds up the process of making offers. In other words, centers have to make decisions on an offer concurrently. This is a process that could be used in conjunction with an expedited pathway and was given a cursory review for potential eventual proposal in the U.S. transplant system. Next slide, please. So offer team is near to completion of its task. It has done an initial draft turn-in of its project, is now doing some final refinement. It will start meeting again soon within the next week to complete its work. Keep in mind that this team's task was to provide a general definition of organ offer and not to dive into organ-specific criteria for an offer. The team should be complete with its work in a few more meetings and turn in this draft. Once this draft is considered completed, it'll be turned over to the board, and then we'll need organ-specific considerations. Some technology updates would be necessary to complete and implement this proposal. The EPP team is also near to completion, but is currently on pause. Once the final draft for the offer team is turned in, the work for the EPP team will continue. The allocation off sequence larger group will reduce to a small team to focus on EPP. HRSA has provided commentary and recommendations for the EPP team, which will be integrated into the draft once the team started up again. We estimate that this project will take at most a couple more months to turn in its final draft. We hope that once this has been integrated and accepted as an OPTN practice for kidneys, that it could be used as a model to establish expedited processes for other organs. Simultaneous clocks project is on pause. It is a very ambitious project, and we believe it could be important advancement, but would need significant technology upgrades to realize it. This project would also need significant work, not only with technology, but also with policy. And finally, the audit project is currently on pause. It is pending further board review and refinement. It is also has received a comment from HRSA. We may be able to integrate this project with some other like dashboard or metrics projects that are currently ongoing to align it with those. And there may be an opportunity to circle back with this project once the safety and compliance contractor is on board and has its footing. I thank everyone from the community, from HRSA, AIR, and OPTN for all their contributions and for the opportunity to work on this project. We look forward to turning in an offer and then completing EPP and turning it in. And I would specifically like to thank Kevin Lee and Dr. Stephen Potter for their work. Thank you, John, and I'll turn it back over to you for any questions. Doug?
Great. Thanks, Justin. Amazing summary of an enormous amount of work done with great care and urgency. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. I'm not sure, Doug, if you see hands.
I see no hands at the moment.
All right. Well, all right, we'll give another second. Not hearing any. Go ahead, Sam.
You're on mute, Sam.
Sorry, yep, just realized. A lot to absorb in a short moment. I'm certain I'll have more questions later, but I guess initial thoughts, given so much of this is now paused. So with this offer definition, will that be retroactively applied to existing policy, or do you anticipate this new definition only carrying forward through the work of the EPP team? Or because given that there wasn't a definition, I wonder whether there's any thought of an impact assessment of what this new definition may do in alignment, or whether it exists in alignment, or whether it is a problem with existing OPTN policy where offers are referenced.
No, that's a good question. And I'm not going to pretend like I have the perfect answer for that, but I will say that in order to work through this project, they kind of had to retroactively look at, the past and what possibly could have been done with an offer. I can't imagine that they're going to go back and apply this. Now, if you're talking about, will there need to be new policy? The answer is undoubtedly, especially with it needing organ-specific kind of adjustments. But I don't think, if you're saying, are they going to go back and look and see what would have been an offer in the past? I think some of that has to be done to a certain extent to see when you implement it, but that would be about the limit of it. I'll let somebody else answer that if they have a better idea than me.
Yeah, I think, as you said, Justin, the historic component was useful, but we wouldn't be applied retroactively in a negative sort of way. So I think we can only move forward, and it would have to be this again, as you mentioned, Sam. This is a lot of information, and anything here would be communicated more formally.
Yeah, I guess looking at the fact that it will go for public comment and that we'll review having not seen any actual, information other than kind of the progress on it, is it truly just going to be a definition that we're agreeing to? It's not really a policy, even though it's going to go through what would typically be a policy proposal framework or workflow, right?
If you're asking, would there be any effects on OPOs? The answer is yes, because there's going to be various aspects, but some of it would be how it's recorded, that OPOs or centers, let's say the entire entity, would be forced to do things in a certain order, in a certain way, so that it could be recorded properly. So
yeah, and my question isn't specific to OPOs. I guess my question is specific to the work product that is coming out. Is it a policy or just a definition of an offer that then policy will have to be built upon?
Yeah, so interesting question, and that we've debated that. I believe let's get the draft turned in, and I think the board will review it, and I think we'll probably make a determination on how we want to proceed at that time. And then anything before that will be probably a little presumptuous.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, Justin. But your question is right: is what level of clarification requires public comment and vote versus definition, component of things. But there needs to be harmony across everywhere it's applied, which is tougher than it would sound. So
I think we have. I'm sorry, John. I say we have Nahel and then Taylor.
Thanks a lot, Justin. Great work and nicely presented. My question was on the EPP team. I know you mentioned specific to kidney. I understand it's the biggest problem in AOS, but are we not looking at other organs, number one? And number two, was the team specifically looking at scenarios where an expedited allocation would be permitted, or were they also looking at tools to facilitate that?
Okay, so EPP was specific to kidneys because it was a critical comment from HRSA on kidneys specifically that drove it. It was separate from allocation out of sequence, and then we determined it fit well into the allocation out of sequence project, integrated it. We also determined that we thought if we could solve the expedited placement for kidneys, then we would at least have a process established that could be then turned over to other organs. So that's the reason that it started with kidney. It was a directive due to some issues that were realized in the data. To your second part of the problem, or what was the second part of the second question?
Were you looking at tools to resolve it, or just define scenarios that
Oh, I
EPP
got
would be
you.
acceptable?
So, yeah, so there's two things here. One is the doorway to get to allocate the expedited pathway, and then what happens afterwards. So all this team has done so far is define. Now there's going to be a number of other issues that'll follow on with technology and all that, is define the criteria that would allow an expedited pathway. So the first step is whatever those criteria are, KDPI or different factors. If it meets those minimum eligibility, then it could be, it wouldn't have to be, but it could be sent into an expedited pathway. So if you're talking about the tools, meaning what happens post that, we haven't got to that far yet.
And there will be, I mean, at the end of the day, all the organs will need to be assessed and integrated, and it'll be a holistic approach to the problem so that no potential organ is wasted and they're allocated in a compliant manner. So that's what we need to do, is line those up. So, Taylor.
Just to clarify the question of is the definition going to be a policy or not? OPTN policy has a number of terms that are defined as part of OPTN policy. And so while definitions, seem like a relatively basic thing, they are something that we are working towards codifying and putting into OPTN policy. And that way, all future policy can refer to the definitions that will be clear, and everyone will have the same definitions to work from, so that everyone understands more clearly what the policies are trying to say. So not necessarily the most exciting policy, but definitely a foundational and important one.
Sarah.
My comment is kind of just reiterating what Taylor and previously Justin said, which is to answer Sam's question. The draft of the policy that was turned in to this point, sort of where it stands right now, includes both definitions and also just some clarifying language in the part of the policy that actually defines making an offer around the process of making an offer, to John's point, to have it be documented so that it is auditable and legible in the data.
And we also will have more discussion with Foley Hoag and a bunch of people. We haven't gotten this far in the Taylor and Sarah's points. We haven't gotten that far in the discussion. So thanks, Andrew.
Yeah.
Thanks, John and Justin. I have maybe a question that's for our HRSA colleagues as it relates to this. So when we paused ongoing work with continuous distribution in other organs, we were tasked with creating lung transplant specific policy to address allocation out of sequence, and then this specific policy work that Justin's team has been leading. Given where we are now, do we need to have all of these sort of work groups complete before we can consider restarting work on continuous distribution in the other organs? Or is having this part complete sufficient to allow that process to go forward?
I think it would depend a little bit on where they stand and what the bandwidth is. So some of the things that are very expensive and technology dependent. So if I'm just making this up, but if the eighth thing on this list, which there isn't an eighth, if that required a new system to be entirely operational, that will take longer than a year to finally fully operationalize. So I don't see them all needing to be completed as part of that. We've got a running start on this problem, but
Yeah, that's my subtext, I guess, John. I'm kind of looking for some benchmarks because this was presented to us as being a kind of urgent patient safety issue. And I just want to highlight again that, lung transplant has seen something about a 30% decline in our waitlist mortality in the context of continuous distribution, which is a significant patient safety concern, and that we are still pausing these efforts that our committees have been very, I think, assertive about the importance of these efforts for patient care. So is there any concrete benchmarks we can get about meeting the HRSA requirements?
I don't think at this second would be my response, but it required more. It also will require both better understanding of the financials and the priorities and a bunch of other things. But certainly this at some we'll take that back and discuss and review. I don't know if we have an exit. It won't. Everything being checked off is not going to happen, and we've made substantive progress. So it's a good question. I just don't have the answer to this second.
Thanks,
The
John.
other thing I'll flag is that part of the concern was seeing the outcomes of continuous distribution. I think it would be helpful to see some direct resolution of the concerns with continuous distribution in lung, namely that policy compliance really dropped dramatically when it was instituted. So I think if some of these changes seem to have the impact we're looking for, that's the kind of sign we're looking for.
Yeah. Specific to
helpful.
reiterate what Sarah said, that if we can make it easier to follow policy, the competing demands get simpler to operationalize. So I was mostly saying that so I can process it in my head. Next question. Any other questions? All right. Well, again, there'll be more. This again is an update, not the final word on this, and we'll wrap up kind of with the as this moves along. There'll be parts of it that will hopefully be operationalized in definitions, policy, and then I suspect there'll be still a couple things we're working on for some time to come, and then onboarding other stuff as bandwidth permits. So, all right. Well, thanks again to Justin and the team. So next we're going to go over to some quick updates. Next slide. So one thing I just want to mention again to everyone on the board is aware, there was a OPTN communication earlier this month regarding discontinuation of COVID era practice that allowed donor screening parameters to be adjusted to limit the number of offers somebody might receive while in the midst of the pandemic. They were part of a public health emergency response, and it was meant to be temporary. The board that was rescinded because the COVID-19 pandemic emergency has ended. In addition, the communication reinforced that all transplant programs are expected to operate in full alignment with current OPTN policy and not rely on pandemic era practices or other practices to alter waitlist impact waitlist times by altering donor criteria. Along those lines, there's a lot of data entry, and we want to follow this moving forward to make sure that the data ranges fall into acceptable parameters. And so a work group is going to be convened with the charge of clarifying the appropriate use of inactive status, as well as specifics with respect to data entry, so that some front end edit checks can be put in so the coordinators know are you sure you want to enter this weight range or height range? Again, keeping it very broad because there's a lot of individualization, but not things like 98 to 99 years old. So that's and I'll take questions at the end. The next update is regarding upcoming national town hall meetings. We're planning on holding 2 town hall meetings in lieu of our traditional spring regional meetings this year. This shift allows us to do a couple things, including reliably present consistent communication across the community during this bridge period. There are 2 town halls currently scheduled, April 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern and May 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Each session is going to include an update on current and upcoming OPTN activities, as well as an update from HRSA with time for questions from the membership. An OPTN bulletin was sent out to the community yesterday with full details and a registration link. Those updates or the reminders will go out on a regular cadence. You can also sign up for these town halls via the OPTN website. I encourage individuals to submit questions in advance when they register, because we might be able to group some of the questions together, but there'll also be the opportunity to participate and pose questions during the town halls. And then finally, as a reminder, board officer elections are coming up. The board at our last meeting on April 3rd voted to extend the terms of myself and Shelley Hall as president and vice president in those roles. There was an announcement set out yesterday to all OPTN members notifying them that the 2026 OPTN national elections will be held May 15th through May 22nd. The board officer positions on this year's ballot are the secretary and vice president of patient and donor affairs. Dr. Reed, who is our treasurer, is not up for election this year. And the May, so those are the updates on those elections. The May 1st ad hoc board meeting is going to be activated for the board to review and ratify the nominating committee's slate of candidates. And at that time, it's the sole item of business during that meeting. The finalized slate of candidates will be communicated to OPTN members shortly before the board ratification. And the June 5th, we also anticipate standing up that ad hoc board meeting for the board to formally ratify the results of the national election. And I may have missed, that's the June 5th ad hoc meeting will be used to ratify the results of the national election. And the new term for newly elected officers and committee members will be July 1st, 2026. Any questions? Do you see any hands, Doug?
I see no hands raised, Dr. McGee.
Okay. All right, great. Give it another second. All right. So with those updates, I'm now going to open the floor for other or new business before we move into closed session. Sam.
I know when the call for volunteers went out for committees, it was with the timeline of, Q1 to have the contractor to support committees in line. I know there's reprioritization going on, but I just didn't know whether there was any update on whether a contractor exists or what the timeline is, since we're through Q1 and haven't gotten any update to that it's moved forward.
I don't have any. Brianna or anyone from HRSA?
I'm not sure Brianna's here. She's out today.
Okay.
Apologies that we can't say more than we can say. It is moving forward is as much as I think we're able to say at this time. I promise things are happening inside the house.
Steve.
Will we be able to say something more concrete at the town halls? Because I know I've been hearing more than a little chatter from people currently on committees and people who wish to be on committees. So that, I think the chatter, you might have some jeers at the town hall if you don't have something. I mean, you can't do things you can't do, but just keep that in mind.
100%.
Hey, I can answer that on behalf of HRSA. So the rules around speaking when there's ongoing contracting are very strict. So we can tell you that there is a great deal of work going on, but we can't give any more specifics on that. I know that that is inherently unsatisfactory to people's curiosity, And curiosity here is well placed because you want to know if you could be, giving a significant portion of your time in the next year. It happens as soon as it happens, and we want to make sure that we don't do anything that puts either individuals on the board or on the committees or anybody at risk of violating these federal rules.
Thanks, Ray. Oh, yeah, and our first knowledge will really be that somebody has been named. So in this next step will be that. So Kim.
Sorry, my video doesn't work on this particular computer, but apologies. It's best for you to not have to see me. I've had somebody reach out from our community just with some concerns on the NRP work group, or not work group, but the documents and the presentations that we've had so far, which I know is still an ongoing process. Do I forward this to who specifically so that we can actually try to address there are legit concerns. Some of them we have addressed, some of them it's not clear to me that we have, but it's a lot to kind of go through.
Yeah.
Just right now. So I just want to make sure these people get heard. And I suspect you'll hear at the town hall. So perhaps even just, having a discussion about this sort of might be preemptive in avoiding a lot of extra questions.
Absolutely. We've gotten a broad amount of responses to it. You can send it to Doug, and he will circulate it to PJ, who's the chair of the group, and the NRP work group will see it. There's currently some comments that are undergoing review from the legal team, both within at HRSA and HRSA leadership as well. And once those get formulated, we'll have another presentation of it. And again, all these things, any policy will undergo the normal policy making process as well. So. Thanks for that feedback, Kim. All right. Any other questions before we move into closed session? Okay. I don't see any. Well, with that, I'd like to thank the members of the public who have tuned in for this board meeting, and we're now going to move into closed session.
Thank you, Dr. McGee. We will confirm once we are in closed session for attendees today. If you're not on the board, you may disconnect from the meeting, and thank you for attending.